Hey guys, it's Makeshift. This is the fourth video in my plush clothes series, and in my previous video I used the paper towel patterning method to develop this pattern for a button-up shirt. And in this video I'm going to sew it together. Even if you didn't use the paper towel patterning method to develop a pattern, for example, if you took apart an existing pattern, you'll still find the principles here useful. For the most part, shirts all have very similar patterns to one another. So at this point I've pinned together the right sides of the front and the back of the fabric just at the shoulders. So I've sewn the shoulders together with right sides together, and then I also press that seam because it's super important to press the seams on any clothing fabric because it makes them look a lot neater. Now I can go ahead and pin the sleeves in place, and I can also sew these darts. For the darts, you're just going to fold along the line that you cut with right sides together and then pin it into place. And then when you sew it, you're just going to sew in your seam allowance, but then taper the stitch down to gradually meet where the fold of the fabric is. And you want to make that very gradual and to come to a nice stop, because if this ends up being very jagged, then your dart is going to have a point to it that doesn't look very clean. So that can be a bit tricky to eyeball, so you can just trace the line that you want to sew with a air-soluble or a water-soluble fabric pen, and then you can just sew right along that line. And because this fabric is white, it's going to show through, so you should probably go ahead and wash that off when you're done. So again, to sew this dart, I'm going to sew along this gradual line here, and I'm going to end where the fabric is folded. And instead of back stitching up here, I'm going to pull out the thread and then tie a knot, because this also helps you get a cleaner finish on the dart at the end. So my needle is now past my fabric, so I'm gonna put the needle up, lift the foot and pull, and then I just put my finger between the bobbin thread and the normal thread, and then I cut the thread, and now I'm just going to tie a knot. And so this will make a cleaner dart. The easiest way to sew sleeves is when you've just sewn the shoulder of the body of the shirt together, and then you're going to attach the open sleeve to the shoulder. And sewing these opposing curves can be pretty tricky. It will take some getting used to, but eventually you'll get the hang of it. This is where it's very important to have the shape of the sleeve cap correct with the way it fits inside of the armhole, which is why I usually prefer for shirts to take apart a pattern that already exists, because this is very tricky to get right. So if you find that you really can't fit this together, you may need to adjust your pattern. So I like to start by pinning at the edges and making sure that you have the correct front of the sleeve aligned with the front of the shirt, and having your right sides together, and then go to the back and pin along the edge. And then to kind of almost pull and try to find the middle of the sleeve cap aligned with the middle of the shoulder. And pin there, and then you can ease the amount in between the 2 points. So that eyeball was pretty off, because you can see the amount of fabric I have on this side is a lot less than the amount of fabric on this side, so I'm just going to adjust and move it over. But the trick here is to use a lot of pins to try and get it to fit, and you want the line that you're going to sew over to be not bulky and to not have any folds of fabric. And it's good to make sure that you're looking at the back side to make sure that it's not getting bunched up as well as you're pinning. You want both sides to be flat and smooth. Okay, so that's looking better, but I am going to baste this first, which means I'm just going to do a longer stitch and then I'm going to make sure it looks alright, and then I'll go over it with a tighter stitch. So now I'm going to sew the sleeve, and again I'm doing a basting stitch, so it's 5 millimeters long, just to make sure that everything is fitting together and I don't have any big bumps that I need to correct. It'd just be harder to seam rip if it was a shorter stitch. So when I look at this with the pins out, it looks clean. There's no bumps along where I sewed it to the armhole, and it's wrinkly, but I just need to iron it. There's no big overlapping of fabric or creases that are from sewing the pieces incorrectly together. So I can go ahead and do the other sleeve now using the same exact method. And then I'm also going to go back over this seam with a shorter stitch so that it's not being held into place with just a very long stitch, which is not going to be secure. So I sewed on the other sleeve, and then I also pressed the seams of the sleeves and also the darts to make them much cleaner. And now I can go ahead and flip the shirt so that the right sides of the shirt are together. I'm going to line up the sleeve seams, so where the sleeve meets the body right here, and I'm going to pin it in place. And then I'm also going to line up the bottom of the shirt. It's off by like 1/8 of an inch, but that's fine. We're just going to fold it to finish the edge anyway. And then line up the edge of the sleeve, and then I'm going to pin in between. And now we're going to sew from the edge of the sleeve all the way down to the bottom of the shirt on both sides. So here that seam is sewn 1/4 inch from the edge, just sewing from the edge of the sleeve to the bottom of the shirt. So I'm going to trim this seam because I want the sleeve to fall nicely. I'm going to trim this, just to get rid of some of that bulk. And then once I do that, I'm also going to press the seam open as well to get it nice and clean. For the collar, you'll need to line the collar, otherwise the entire thing is going to be a raw edge. So to do that, I've cut 2 of the collar patterns, and on one of them I turned up the seam allowance on the bottom 1/4 inch. So I turned it up and I ironed it in place. And on the other one I did not do that, and that's because we're going to sew only one of this neckline to the shirt, and then we're going to top stitch the other one down. We're going to pin this with right sides together, and I'm going to look at the side with the turned edge, and I'm going to open it up and pin where the fold is, where I ironed it, and sew to that fold right there. And then just pin along the edges. So again, you can line up the entire edge here, but then pin where you've ironed the bottom of the one piece of the collar. And now I'm going to sew from one ironed edge to the other ironed edge all the way on the outside here. So for the collar, I'm going to trim the seam and then turn it right side out and press it. And on these corners that stick out, you also want to just trim as much bulk away from it as you can, because that'll help you get a pointy end to it. But you definitely don't want to hit any of your stitches or get too close. And I like to use these point turner tools to push out the corners in a piece like this. Okay, now I'm going to press this collar along the seam I just sewed to make it cleaner. So now I can pin the collar onto the shirt, and I'm going to pin the side that I did not fold and iron with right sides together, of course, and I find it easier just to start from the back of the middle and then to work your way forward. So if you didn't mark your middle, if you put it on a fold, then you can kind of see where the exact middle is, just from the natural fold of the fabric from when you cut it out. But you might want to mark it too, just to make it a bit easier. So I'm going to go all the way to the edge here where I stopped sewing, where the fold of the other part of the collar begins. So now I'm just going to sew from point to point. So I've sewn this seam, and the iron side is kept free so it wasn't sewn in here as well, and you can see how the stitches just kind of meet at a point here, and that other stitch was the other seam that I did to sew the two pieces of the collar together. So to finish the collar, then we're going to take the folded side and place it over the seam that you just sewed. So we're going to top stitch this into place by stitching in the ditch, it's called, of that seam that you just sewed. So it's going to hide the stitches that you're going to make because it's going to be right in this line. You just want to make sure that when you sew that out, that it's actually going to catch this folded part of the collar. So when you line it up, just make sure that this fold is a little bit past the seam that you just sewed. So I'm also going to try and tuck in this extra fabric here from the seam up into the collar. And so because we're going to sew on this side, I'm going to pin on this side. So it can be a little tricky. You can do this, or you can also actually pin in the seam itself. And that way you can get a really good view of how it's going to stitch out when your stitch actually goes through the fabric. So kind of have to go back and forth of flipping it over moving the collar onto the inside, hiding that raw edge up there, and then flipping it over and pinning it in place. So now at the same time we can finish off the edges of the remaining sides that we haven't addressed yet. So one of them is the sleeve, and again, you remember I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance here so I can turn it into the inside like this, and then I can stitch right around the edge of the sleeve so that I can tack it down and that I have a nice finished edge. But I'm going to iron this first before I sew it, just so that it doesn't move at all when I'm sewing it. So pretty much going to do the same thing with the other sides, and because of how we sewed the collar on, this top edge is already tucking itself in, so we really just need to iron that in place and then also sew along the edge. So you're also going to need to do that with the front edge as well as the bottom edge. So you're going to tuck in your extra all the way along all these raw edges, iron it, and then sew over it so that you're tacking it down into place. So this is where you could just add a little bit more than 1/4 inch, so you aren't having too much difficulty folding it and ironing it down and sewing it, because it can get a little tight because that's so small. But you just want to finish off all your raw edges, and you might not have as many as I do if you're not doing a button up, but because we're doing a button up, you have these extra 2 front edges that need to be finished off instead of just the bottom of the shirt. So I have my raw edges ironed down, so they are all clean now. So I just have to stitch them in place by just doing a very narrow 1/8 to 1/4 inch seam right around the edges to tack down the raw edges. And then I can also stitch in the ditch to catch the collar on the underside. So I'm going to sew the collar part first because there's a bunch of pins sticking out that I don't want to hit me whilst I sew the rest of it. So I'm just going to line up my needle exactly with that seam so that it's going to land in the seam every time I sew. So you can see how these stitches are right in that seam that we originally sewed to attach the collar. If we flip it over to the other side, the collar is caught by that stitch that we just sewed. So that collar is finished now. So now we need to tack down these raw edges, and I don't always use pins because when you iron it, it's just going to naturally fall into place, but you can definitely pin it down if you need to. I like to line up the edge of the fabric exactly with the edge of my foot. Then I usually move my needle over just so I have about 1/8 of an inch to catch that narrow fabric that I turn upward to finish that edge. And then I'm just going to stitch all the way around this shirt. Alright, and now I just have to finish off the sleeve, so I like to stitch on the inside of the sleeve instead of doing it on the outside like this, just a personal preference, but I do pretty much the same thing where I line up the edge of the foot with the edge of the sleeve. And then because I have a 1/2 inch there, I'm just going to move my needle into the middle of the position here and just stitch. And once you get in towards the edge here, I like to lift my foot and pull forward on the sleeve, kind of reset where you're sewing forward. And that way you don't have to pick everything up and start over again. Then I only have one more sleeve to go. So I went ahead and ironed the edges just to give it an extra clean look, and I also ironed the collar because it's meant to be sticking out, so I ironed it in place so that it would have this bend up here. So now because it's a button up, it needs some buttons, so I put it on the plush so that I could just double check the fit of it, and I need to mark where the buttonholes are going to go. So the buttonholes are going to be on the top part of the shirt that folds over, accounting for where the pants are going to land. I'm just going to do 2, so I'll do one about here, and then I'll do another one a little bit further down. So the easiest way to sew buttonholes onto your clothes is to use a buttonhole foot. So I believe this should come standard with a lot of machines now. And just like a normal sewing foot, it's something you put on your machine, and it's going to sew a little square or whatever shape buttonhole you select for you. So you don't have to do that satin stitching and get it even and the perfect length for whatever button you have. So to measure out how long the stitch should be, you actually insert one of the buttons that you plan on using into this back part here that moves up and down. And that determines how long the buttonhole it will stitch out is. So I'm just going to sew the 2 buttonholes on my shirt where I marked them to be. These are some of the buttonhole stitches on my machine. I typically always do this completely rectangular one, and so you can do whatever you'd like, and because of how you put the button in the buttonhole foot, it's just all going to be the same length. Just whatever style you want it to be. So you also have to put a little foot down here in the back. If you just feel the back of your sewing machine, you can pull this down, and that's required to sew buttonholes with this foot and the stitch that you select. And so the stitch on mine starts in the beginning and then goes back, so I'm just going to align the marks on the buttonhole foot with the front of the line that I drew, and then just let it sew out for me. So you just hold the foot of the machine down and just let it go all the way. And that's it. Sewn a nice little buttonhole. And then I'll just repeat the process for the next one. So the last thing I like to do for buttonholes for fabric that frays like this is to apply fray check to it. So there's a whole bunch of different types of this. A common brand is actually fray check, but anything that's made to prevent fabric from fraying you can use. And so you just use the bottle to put a little bit inside of the buttonhole. And I've used different types, and one is more of like a liquid consistency, and this one's more like glue. And so you just put it on the inside, and then I rub it with my finger to get it into the fabric. And I like to do the other side too. And then when you seam rip this open, the fabric won't fray on the inside. So like on some of these edges on the inside of the shirt, you can see how there's little pieces of fabric that come off. So now that won't happen on the buttonholes. So you have to let this dry. It doesn't take too long, depending on what type you have. It says 24 hours, but honestly I just wait for it to actually dry to the touch and then I go ahead and seam rip it. But if you really want to be sure about it not fraying, you should just go ahead and wait the full amount. Once the fray check has dried, you want to go ahead and take a seam ripper and open up the inside of the buttonhole. So you're just going to stick the pointy end into one of the ends and then push through it. And you want to be careful when you get to the end because you don't want to cut through the second set of horizontal stitches. So to figure out where you want your buttons to be on the other side of the shirt, you would just overlap it how you want it to lay, and then you can kind of just hold your button and lift up the top part of the shirt, put the button in place, and then sew it down. And this is just simple hand sewing. You want to start from the back so that your knot is hidden on the inside of the shirt, and then just go through the buttonholes decent number of times. Kind of depends on how often you're going to be taking these clothes on and off. I don't intend on taking them on and off very much, so I'm just going to do a few stitches in each hole. But if you anticipate it getting a lot of use, then you'll want to make sure that this is nice and secure. And at one point then I reverse direction, so I go through the next hole, but then I go back to the hole I just came from, so that you're making a nice square out of the thread. And if this happens where it gets bunched up like this, you can just pull on the thread, basically undoing what you just did. You want to separate it to where there's a loop like this, where you're pulling it like that. And then you can just re-pull it through. And if it's still happening, you can give it a tug and it should just go through. Sometimes you might need to pull just on one thread or the other and it'll come through, but this can easily be fixed. Alright, I'm just going to snip off the thread and tie a knot. Trim off the excess, so then you can just sew on the other button the exact same way that you did the first one. And once the buttons are sewn on, then you're all done. You can put it on your plush and admire your hard work. If you look on the inside, you can see that it's still got raw edges in here, and since this is just a personal project, I'm not too worried about that. If this was a commission, then I would try to make this a little bit cleaner on the inside, and there's a few different ways you can do that. One is if you have a serger, which is a special type of sewing machine that does an overlocking stitch. An overlocking stitch has a zigzag pattern that finishes off the edges of the fabric as it sews. So you won't have any fraying on a shirt that has an overlock stitch. I have a serger and I will use it from time to time on my commissions, but I don't always do that. But if it is something that is going to be taken off, then it's kind of nice to have a nice finish on the inside. It is kind of difficult to sew with. It's particularly hard on 90-degree angles just because it cuts the fabric as it sews. And it's a kind of a pricey machine too, so if you're just starting out, then you probably don't want to buy one just for plush making. I have one because I make cosplays from time to time. Another way you can do this is just to extend the amount of seam allowance you have at the bottom here. So instead of having a 1/4 inch, you could do a 1/2 inch and then fold it twice. So you would fold it once up and then again, so that that raw edge would be tucked under. So if I were to do that here just to show you, I would fold it once and then fold it one more time, and now you no longer have a raw edge at the bottom. The other option is to line the clothing piece. So lining is just where you're essentially making the same item twice and then sewing it together. So I have a partially lined jacket here for the same plush that I'm working on, and I say partially lined because I didn't bother with the armholes. But since this is a suit coat and it's going to hang open, I didn't want to have these raw edges in the plush because you'll be able to see them since it's not going to button close. So I just made this from the same pattern that I showed you how to make. I just enlarged it a little bit and I changed the shape of the collar. And I cut it out twice and then sewed it together, and you sew it together along the very edges of the shirt, and then you leave a little gap in the collar where it connects to the shirt, and then you flip it right side out. And when you flip it right side out, then you no longer have any raw edges and you're just looking at two clean sides. So that's a very brief description of lining. There's a lot of resources online for sewing actual clothes that teach you how to line them. So you could do a quick Google if you're interested in learning more about that. So here's the finished shirt on the plush. Looks good, it fits him well, definitely better than anything I'd be able to draft completely from scratch without doing the paper towel patterning method, and looks good with the pants as well. And if you missed it, I do have a video on how I did the paper towel patterning method with these pants also that you can check out. So hope you found this video helpful and the whole series as well, and good luck with all your plush clothes making. See you next time.